So welcome everyone. We will now get started with tonight's program. Thank you for joining us as we welcome Professor Nick Admison from Cornell University. My name is Paola Joven and I'm an associate professor of modern Chinese literature here in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. Our talk tonight is hosted by the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Chicago, otherwise known as CEUS. CEUS is an interdisciplinary nexus, clearinghouse, and resource for academic exploration and support related to the study of China, Japan, and Korea. For more information of CEUS and to subscribe to receive weekly outreach emails pertaining to future events sponsored by the center, please click on the links that will be provided in the chat box. Now, before I introduce our guest speaker, I'd like to remind everyone about the Q&A session that will follow tonight's presentation. To ask a question, please be sure to type in your questions in the Q&A box. And I would also really like to thank our staff at CEUS, Connie Eep, and Myra Soon for helping us organize this event and for helping us, for being present also tonight and help us streamline things. So I'm really delighted to welcome Professor Nick Admison. Professor Admison teaches modern Chinese literature at Cornell University. He's an associate professor there. He holds an MFA in poetry writing from Washington University of St. Louis and a PhD in East Asian Studies from Princeton. Professor Admison's first book, Recite and Refuse, Contemporary Chinese Prose Poetry, was published by Hawaii University Press in 2016. It's a beautiful study. It offers the first sustained and theoretically sophisticated engagement with the genre of prose poetry. The book dispels widely held misconceptions and proposes a thoroughly convincing new history of the genre, supported by beautiful translations and engaging critical readings of many texts. Professor Admison is also the author of several articles on Chinese poetry. Chinese poetry is actually his main focus of study, and he's also the editor of a wonderful special issue of the journal Modern Literature in Chinese, devoted to Lu Xun's Ye Cao, or Wild Grass. In addition to being a literary historian, theorist, and critic, Professor Admison is also a prolific poet and translator. He's the author of 5 chapbooks of original poetry, and his most recent translation works include a collection of the poet Yang Shi, titled Floral Matter. Tonight, the lecture that Professor Admison is offering tonight draws from his current comparative project on what he defines as literary stricture in Chinese poetry and American poetry and culture. So please join me in virtually welcoming Professor Admison, and thank you everyone for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I appreciate it a lot. And thanks everybody for coming out. It's a little bit hard. And one of the formal limitations of a talk like this is giving one's sort of scholarly tradition and citing them and sort of putting oneself in a historical. But I want to, and McGill Van Crevel and Michelle Ye, who have worked on this poem that we're going to talk about today, are in the talk, but there's another scholar named He Yi who wrote one of the first articles on File Zero that we're going to talk about. And I want to sort of hold up that person who's really important in my understanding of the poem. I also want to thank Connie and Myra, and as well as in a fundamental way, Professor Jovene, whose work on contemporary literature and contemporary fiction kind of convinced me that to be a contemporary scholar, you also have to be producing futures. That was a big step for me in my development as a scholar, and I'm really grateful for it. So I'm going to share my screen, and somebody will jump in and chat if this doesn't work out well. But this should be about right. This photograph is of a police officer in protective COVID gear. You can almost see the on his back, the Jingcha. He's stopping off after lunch to read a book at the Fangcang Hospital in Chengdu. And I show you this because I kind of love this image. I love the ease of his body. And he sort of breaks through some of that anxiety and pain that I think we've all been feeling during the pandemic. But I also show it to you to introduce you gently to the conceptual space that I want to inhabit during this lecture. I want to say, first off, that agents of the state and police read books much like the rest of us read books. They like some more than others. They learn to read in school. They interpret energetically. It's not so different than reading of non-police actors. Lu Wei, who was the head of the cyberspace administration between 2013 and 2016, he's disgraced now, I think. While they were tightening controls over the internet, he was a graduate of the Guangxi Television and Radio University in the literature department. If you get an MA or a PhD in China, you'll sit next to somebody who goes into government service. They're in that same track, right? They're trained in the same way as a literature professor would be. Similarly, if you come get a BA at Cornell, you will sit next to people who will go into American government service. These people are coming from the same body of readers. And so methods of reading are similar across the two groups of people that we think of as quite differently. William Maxwell, who we're going to talk about in a little bit, tells a great story about a CIA agent who was tasked with reporting on Lorraine Hansberry, the playwright. And he really loved her play, Raisin in the Sun. He really sort of identified with Benita Younger. And so he said, no political problems for Lorraine Hansberry. No great artist could really be a problem, even as radical as she was. The reason I'm walking you through this exercise is because just like police read like the rest of us, and this is a little harder to accept, I think, the rest of us read often like police. Like agents of an empowered institution or an authority, or as agents of a desire that comes out and is expressed through and is fulfilled through our reading. We're going to look at a poem that shows how the habits and the powers of regular readers of literature create a stricture, create a restriction or a limit on authorial expression and all sorts of other functions of literature. And then I'm going to end by talking about what I do as a scholar, or what we do as scholars, once we accept that reader activity is also surveillance activity. First, though, I have to zoom out a little bit and talk about the book that this chapter, this section is drawn from. And I'm finishing it right now. If my health holds up, I will hopefully finish it in the near future. It's called probably Literary Stricture in Chinese Poetry and American Culture. And the point of the book, as I see it, is to rethink how we think of censorship by zooming out to look at state censorship and that sort of iconic image of the bureaucrat crossing out, using a red pen to cross out individual lines of literary production, to zoom out and to see literary censorship as state censorship as just one type of restriction or stricture that literature, that shape literature, right? Art's constrained by its form. It's constrained by economics. It's constrained by its mediation, by its shape in media, by copyright law, and as we'll discuss today, by its perceived and real reception by readers. The idea of the right to speech has always been constrained and negotiated. It's constrained by the very shape of the mouth, right? By the capacity of the lungs. Bourdieu says that discourse is the result of a negotiation between an expressive interest and a censorship. And this book, by allowing for many different types of restriction, tries to get into how that negotiation between the two works, and how artists negotiate between the two. What I find is that when you examine many different types of stricture, you see how they start to interact with one another. And this is probably influenced by Carolyn Levine, who I read very carefully. they interfere with each other. Sometimes two restrictions will be in conflict, and an artwork has to choose one or the other. Sometimes they reinforce one another. Sometimes they interfere in ways that are unpredictable. The process of negotiating these interpenetrating systems of rules and opportunities that the rules create is actually art. And in this, I follow Yan Liangke, who said, an examination of censorship is actually a deeper study of literature itself. So, and I offer this painting as an example. This is by an artist I really like named Vincent Chong, and you can find his stuff at, don't leave the presentation, but like you can find his stuff at vincentchong.art. And so the way I would describe his work, his body of work in general, is that in the Journey to the West, he's the monkey, right? He's good at getting free, right? He's tricksy, he's interesting, and he's variable, right? He did a performance art piece. He's a trained calligrapher, a seal carver, and a performance artist. He did a performance piece where he wrote a poetic couplet in characters with a big calligraphy brush in high heels while Everlasting Love by Gloria Estefan was playing in his skivvies, right? And then at the end, in high heels and underwear, and then at the end did a backflip, right? So to this like middle-aged office-bound academic, Vincent is he's free, right? He's good at getting free. And you might ask, or I asked when I saw this piece, which I love, but what's with the boxes, right? Why would this person who has this range of possibilities draw dozens and dozens of boxes and fill every single one minutely? And the answer that the book puts forward is that he's reacting to his stricture. He's adapting to it. As free as he is to do what he wants, and as many options as he has as an artist, every day he still wakes up with a blank page, a blank stage, right? A box. And his freedom, right? His process of liberation comes not exclusively from exiting the box, although that happens sometimes. It happens as well from being able to fill it in many different ways. So the art piece is called Kinds, right? Without the grid, no profusion of solutions to the grid. Without accepting some constraint, no way to speak, right? Anyway, that's the gist. The book is transnational. One of the problems, I think, and one of the negative side effects of the heavy focus on state censorship has been that we think of regimes of stricture as national and as attached to governments, when in fact they move transnationally in extremely fluid ways. I know, and I hope that you know, who built the surveillance software originally that is now being used to oppress the Muslims of Xinjiang. Riot gear and tear gas is global, right? In my own life, I had the experience. I was in China originally in the 90s and 2000s, and then sometime in the teens, the Chinese internet shut down its ability to pirate media. So all of the free music and movies and books, oh my God, there's so many books on the Chinese internet for free, right? Just download them. They started in the teens, they started to obey the WTO enforced like rules about global intellectual property, and all that stuff disappeared, including a great deal of material that was heterodox, that wasn't necessarily in support of the party. So these systems move from place to place. And even though, so talking about the cultures outside China in this book is an honest reflection of how stricture works, right? It just doesn't come exclusively from governments, it moves through governments. And it also helps us see that the cultures of stricture in China are not exotic or exceptional. Chinese poets have been struggling under strong cultures of restriction for generations. That's true. But this is not constrained. This is not just in their place. It happens in lots of places, and it changes over time from place to place. So using them as resources, I hope that the book will be useful for Chicago and Ithaca and wherever you are. That the things that Chinese poets have thought and that they've done will turn into grounds for action in lots of different places. This is also a reason that I like this painting, because Vincent is a calligrapher. He gets something really deep about, or elemental, I guess, about the Chinese character. What's pleasurable about them is that there's so many of them, right? It's just like that with stricture. It's very interesting in China. It's very essential in China, but it's not Chinese, right? He's taken that Chinese character out of its context and seen something in it that is beautiful in a lot of different contexts, even if you don't, even if you're not a calligrapher. So the goal today is to read a poem through its interactions with the limitations placed on it. The poem is Ling Dang An, File 0 by Yu Jian. File 0 is a sprawling 306-line epic poem that was written in 1992. It's most of it is in the form of a security dossier of an individual person who critics and calls Zero, right, Ling. The dossier of the poem accumulates a great deal of information and detail about Zero. Right? In the top box, we see him as a disobedient child, a mostly obedient child with a couple of disobedient characteristics, right? He takes a penny off of the ground and he doesn't hand it in to the correct authorities, but he's hygienic and he fights the 4 pests and he's a good kid, right? He's a good kid with some limitations. In the middle box, he's typified in his young adulthood as a thought criminal, right? And interestingly, you can see the parenthetical comments of the compiler of the file who says, we don't actually know. Somebody said he wants to degenerate, he wants to rape, he wants to go naked, but we don't actually know. So I'm just writing it down because it's probably true, right? But he's figured as this sort of, mental problem, right? This wild thinker, right? And at the bottom, in the bottom box, somebody just rifles through his desk and counts all the things that they find inside and inventories them. The poem goes far past this and reports on things that watchers could never know, like his relationship with his mother. There's this list of like a pharmacopoeia of emotions he had when he was young that are figured as drugs that he's taken or medicines that he's taken. And then there's an impossible contents of his body, listing of the contents of his body that almost like he got autopsied. And he's got 10 kilograms of bones and 5,000 cc's of blood. This that I'm reproducing here is the text that you're looking at on the screen is McGill Van Cravel's very good translation from Renditions magazine. And I've made like 1 or 2 tiny edits for clarity, just for the purposes of this presentation that you can ask about in the Q&A if you're really interested in translation. The poem is prose-like. It doesn't sing very much. And it has these little spaces in between the words, which sometimes fill in for commas or periods, or just slow down and extend the lines of the file. The poem is large, though, and I don't want you to get the sense that I'm like cracking the poem. It contains multitudes. Van Cravel, when he writes about it, focuses in part on the poem's relationship to poetry in general and to form and to genre. Michel Yeh, who I'm quoting at the top of the slide, makes this fascinating comparison between Zero, the subject of this file, and AQ, which I go into in some detail in the chapter, but which we won't talk about tonight. Michel Yeh's quote at the top of the slide title is that this is modern Chinese poetry's, one of modern Chinese poetry's most important, most research-worthy poems. And I agree, actually. I think it holds a lot of thinking, right? The piece that I want to do today is about the relationship of the file in File 0, right? The actual file that we're looking at, and the reader of the file, which is you, the reader of the poem, and also the fictive reader of the file. And to talk about that, we're going to have to look at the frame, the first section and the last section of the poem, which is its frame. And these are excerpts from the beginning and the end of the poem. They're not numbered chapters, so all the file pieces are numbered chapters. This is the opening, right, and the closing piece. In the prologue of the poem, you and I, the readers, are directly addressed with an imperative. We're told to go into the office building, find the file room, open the file room, unlock the file cabinet, pull out the file, open the file folder, and read. Right? We're told this in the imperative. The file is explained in this second section here as the second and third sections of the file room. As I've reproduced them, it's explained as something like a regular Chinese mid-century and later security file. Right? It tells people your political orientation, your crimes, your successes, your friends, tells them about your background, your family, and that all that together determines how you'll be treated by the infrastructure. It's a bit more serious in some ways than a US security file, which is often held in secret. A file like this, depending on the period, might determine whether you could get a job, whether you'll be allowed to be married, whether you'll be given an academic post or a post as a student. So this is an important document, but it's in that form, right? And we're identified as that specific. We're told that it's that specific form in the prologue to the poem. At the same time, though, we are in a poem, right? This is the beginning of a poem, right? We're told to access and read the poem, which almost every poem and poet implicitly asks us to do. They ask for our attention. They demand us to read. A lot of the uses in this third section of the file, of the fictive file of the surveillance file, are also the uses of a poem for a professional poet. We assess a poet through their poetry. In their body, through their body of work, they're seen as individuals and professionals. They're rewarded on the basis of their poetry. They're punished. They're managed through it. Even though we know that theoretically the author is dead and that the relationship between the author and the text has been severed in some conceptual way. If a poem's violent or boring, and this poem is both at different times, a lot of us will start to ask questions about the poet. The poem is, as he says, how we will view the poet as a comrade, for better and for worse. So at the end of the piece, at the bottom of the slide, in that same imperative mood, which Van Crevel translates really accurately, is Chinese isn't inflected, so you don't have a imperative verb ending, but the cues are that all of this should be read in the imperative. So it's necessary to translate it in the way that he did it. At the end of the piece, we are told to collate, transcribe, reproduce, and then categorize and file away Zero's text. In the fictive world, that addresses us as if we are the writer and keeper of the government file. But the real world of the reader lines up with this in several ways. Right? Some readers, like editors and publishers, collect and organize a poem and edit it. Some of us annotate poetry. Our consumption provokes a poem's reproduction or the lack thereof through the market. We take it home, we typify it to our friends, we describe it, we identify it with a genre, we pick out a spot for it in our bookshelves, we ferret it away, right? We close it and we stick it into a spot. The parallel isn't 100% precise, but the fact that the reader is addressed as the surveillance officer helps see ourselves reading the poem. It creates a kind of out-of-body experience. And it's really important because it reifies something I think we all sort of know, that readers of texts are also consuming information about authors through a kind of surveillance that is as confrontational and uncomfortable as it is cooperative. So, and this isn't just about poetry, this is about intersubjectivity. Poetry is a laboratory for the invention, examination, and use of intersubjective models. Poetry experiments with the ways we address one another. This is also, by the way, the quantum of stricture between writer and reader. The writer can only speak as somebody who the reader knows or can learn how to listen to. Somebody who walks up to you and hands you a piece of paper, if you don't even know that it's a poem, you can't interpret it, right? It might seem like raving. You might guess at a context. You might guess at an intersubjective model, and unless you have the right one, you're not going to get the message of the art piece. Intersubjective models are numerous. They appear extremely rarely, and they last a really long time. We still write poetry in the intersubjective models of 4,000 years ago, right? Those ways of addressing one another, we just don't let them go very easily. So we have here the address to the beloved in the upper left, illustrated by this troubadour who's trying to apparently convince a lady of something, and she's not really having it. We have political religious speech, political/religious speech, which has been poeticized and lyricized since the time immemorial, right? And we have here intersubjective model that's common to China, but not exclusive to it, of a person addressing an absent lord or lover, pining for somebody who's gone. And this is, and I want to zoom in on this for a minute, not just because it's Chinese, but because it's interesting. There's layers to it. I mean, this goes all the way back, this tradition goes all the way back to the Shijing and Xu Yuan and the 19 Han poems, the ancient Han poems. But it's a form that often shows a female pining for an absent male man. But it's because of the way that Chinese literature was produced at the time, it's almost always written by men. So you have this image of pining and this image of address that underneath has a separate form of address, right? That's it's homosocial, it's mostly between men, and produces the woman as a sort of an image, right? So I note the complexity of this model underneath this very simple occasion of writing a poem to someone who's gone, because I think Yu Jian's poem presents to us a similarly elemental, complex, intersubjective model, a powerful one that's ubiquitous enough that we can't always see it easily. When I think of a contemporary romantic relationship, I think of the moment of the realization that one is being watched, like a series of dating app notifications. Looking up during an exam or while you're at the library and seeing somebody see you who was watching you while you weren't looking, right? Rituals of attention paying and attention requesting. And then, so from my present position, when I see this painting, which is a screen painting that was made for the Yongzheng Emperor, of a woman who was looking at a set of poems about a spurned lover, and now she's become sort of overcome with emotion and she's looking off into the distance. When I see this painting now, I think of the Yongzheng Emperor intruding into her private space, intruding into her solitude, consuming it and using it for his own fun, right? This was a decoration in the palace. The intersubjective movement of surveillance is everywhere in our lives, and it has been everywhere in our lives for a long time. It's really well epitomized by the uncomfortable way in which readers who are given a speaker of a poem, who are given a character in a poem, try to look past that speaker into the mind of a poet, who, after all, is the person speaking when a poem is read. So one of my answers to the question of why File Zero is the most researchable poem in contemporary Chinese literature, one of my answers to the question is that it aestheticizes an intersubjective form that we're extremely familiar with, the relationship between the agent of surveillance and their target. It does so largely without exoticizing that relationship, which makes it really, I think, extra special. It maps the watcher-watched relationship onto the artistic text that we're very familiar with, and creates the reader and establishes the reader as the watcher and the author as the watched. Then, because it's pulled that relationship into the poem, it can use the ragged boundaries of the poem to delimit that relationship and question it, and examine it and experiment with it. You think, so for example, and it pulls that relationship out of an exclusively governmental and state-based context. You think it's creepy, and I think it's creepy that they have our pictures in Washington, D.C. and Beijing and wherever else we've traveled. That's weird that somebody can just like boot up a computer in Northern Virginia and like see a picture of me, right? Or many pictures of me. But we don't often stop to think about how creepy it is that every publication requires the headshot of almost every publication requires the headshot of an artist, right? That their image has to be attached to books, and over and over and over and over again. I find taking these headshots so upsetting. I don't know about the rest of you who do that, but I only learned to smile for cameras in like 2016. So most of my life, these pictures are like, you know, it looked frightened, I think. Yu Jian has a kind of he's got his his groove. I think he's got his like his way to do it. But it's a traumatized response to being constantly photographed. I think we have art texts like Xu Bing's 2017 movie Dragonfly Eyes, which is a narrative movie that's all shot in surveillance footage. So they just borrowed surveillance footage and gave the narrative through voiceover. And there's no actual camera work or fictive lens. It's all just surveillance stuff. Ai Weiwei has done works like Hansel and Gretel. He made marble sculptures of surveillance cameras. But I don't see artists draw a line between this sort of new, shocking, intrusive surveillance and the basic elemental scopophilia, the desire to know of readers and watchers everywhere. A lot of readers expect that when they read, they will intimately see or discover the mind of the author. And I think that, and you can disagree with me in the Q&A if you think I'm wrong, I don't think that, theories of semiotics and deconstruction have really changed that expectation. Additionally, and this is true in my courses and in a lot of other spaces that I occupy, we additionally believe that process is good, that it is mostly a good thing. It's empathetic, it's noble. These logics, right, of a person being legible, knowable, trustworthy through mediation, trustworthy through textualization, those beliefs and those logics underpin the surveillance state. They encourage people to accept CCTV surveillance and other kinds of being viewed, and they help people accept being viewed. Whether they're true or not, those beliefs are endemic. File 0 drags them into the poem, and then the poem becomes a laboratory to examine and test them. So let's return to the poem and talk about how our surveillance beliefs are tested and challenged. This here is an incident in chapter 3 in which Zero, as a teenager, engages in group masturbation with his school friends. And I'm just gonna read it, this top box. Recollection. On that day, they, male classmates, all of them 13 years old, surged in to the toilet at school. On the walls was drawn all that was forbidden. Masturbate as the first verb, the male's admission ticket, hands all sticky, quickly over and done with. The temperature was just right. Having tasted this small pleasure, the Adams could not find the words to forgive themselves. The words they wanted did not exist outside. Outside was the noun alma mater, the noun classroom. Outside were nouns like garden, pond, blackboard, sports ground, reading room, books, totally irrelevant to the thing at hand. The boys felt desperately suffocated. All they could do was make ambiguous gestures. And then there's a little bit more, and then it says, at the end it says, decree. Delete all of the above 23 lines. Must not be photocopied, circulated, published. So we're told that, and we know probably instinctively, that words don't represent this experience, right? If we shared the experience that's depicted here, we might feel solidarity, we might feel equally constrained, we might feel excited, we might feel the things that, something in relationship to what these boys feel. But we're not getting the experience, we're getting the information. And as consumers of the information, once we see the scene, once it's described to us, I think many of us will have the response of the collator of the file. We feel ashamed, right? We want a private space for these boys. We don't need to see this. We don't want to see it necessarily. If what we're seeing is simply the information of the that's depicted, right? This happens to me all the time on the web. So I click on an image or I watch a video. I think I'm going to get an experience from it. I think something's going to happen to me. But what I get instead is I see somebody humiliated or harmed. And at the end, I wish that the algorithm hadn't recorded the fact that I clicked on that video or image. Like the surveillance agent, I want to disappear. I don't want to have, I want to delete the record, right? There's a chapter in the book that was provoked by the Ying'er by Gu Cheng, the poet Gu Cheng. And at first I was studying how the book was censored and how he left things out of the book and why. And eventually I came to realize that his texts were manipulating my libidinal urge and my search to watch and understand the sex and violence in his life, which was substantial and pretty grim. he knew at some level that readers like me were nibbling after blood, were looking for something salacious, or we're looking for something exciting, we're looking for experience. And he was selling it to me, and I felt mad, ashamed. And I think the chapters in the book really reflect that, that disenchantment. File Zero engages in a fascinating push and pull with its reader's desire. It knows what we want to read, and it knows what we don't. The history of romantic love, this sort of spicy part, is wrapped in pages of numb verbiage, like the box at the bottom, which I'm not going to read because it's boring. This has been confusing. The amount of listing in the poem has been confusing and challenging, I think, for critics. Why doesn't it look like a poem? Why isn't it fun? Why is it like this, right? Why isn't it doing what poems usually do? I think the frame of the poem answers these questions. If you were being watched continuously, what would you do about it? You would do nothing, right? You would fold your arms, you'd keep your head down, and you would internalize as much as possible while showing as little as possible. And that's exactly what Zero does. He's mediocre. He doesn't stick his neck out for anything. When I think about this in terms of art, it explains to me something really important, I think, or interesting at least, about the avant-garde and about Eugene's poetry as well, right? Bourdieu explains the avant-garde in terms of a trade-off. You sacrifice economic capital and you gain social capital, right? Or you gain economic capital and you sacrifice social capital. And they sort of trade off. It's in a field, right? They're a field of forces. But I think there's another element at play. When you refuse to fulfill the desires of your reader to be pleased or coddled or even to be communicated with, you open this enormous linguistic range, right? You can do so much more when you're not trying to serve a reader. When you reject and bore and alienate readers, you're seen less, which can be really good, which can be protective and positive. So these passages, these just lists of things and average activities, his hands move, his feet move, his head moves, his eyeballs move. They work way inside the fictive world of the file as they do outside of the world with the reader, right? So in both cases, it says, look, you don't need to pay I'm not doing anything. You don't need to pay attention here. Just go watch someone else, right? It intentionally wastes the time of the agent and the reader by frustrating their desires. Zero's file makes us sensitive to the ways that readers create limits and obstacles for writers, and how similar it is. William J. Maxwell in this fascinating study talks about the way that the FBI had a biohistoricist reading practice, right? When we read that spicy passage that I just read to you about boys together in the bathroom, we might think, like the FBI did, is Zero gay, right? How gay is Zero? Is Eugene gay? How gay is Eugene? This was useful to the FBI in the mid-century when they were surveilling African-American intellectuals and radicals, because that was information they could use to typify and intervene in the stories of Black intellectuals without their consent. That was powerful, right? And it's similar in our reception of sort of liminally queer material, right? It becomes something when we read into it, when we see something behind the scrim. And we're often pushing forward in that way through a text. We can think also about Marxist criticism, which Maxwell goes into great detail about. This had never occurred to me, but Marxist criticism was a global phenomenon. The FBI was doing it to determine whether people were communists or capitalists. The CCP was doing it to determine whether to praise or blame authors. Academics were doing it in maybe a most elemental way to locate power, the power of interpretation inside the academy. The academic is the arbiter of whether a text is Marxist or not, or how Marxist. Meanwhile, artists who had not been concerned with these issues before, between 1940 and 1970, have to be, and they start asking themselves these questions, and these questions become the constraints of their own work. I learned a lot from Miklos Harasti's book, The Velvet Prison, which is on the right side of the screen. He explained to me something that I'd never understood about why artists participate sometimes enthusiastically in state socialist literary scenes. somebody like Moyan or lots of artists that I respect, right? They get in there and they're in the Writers Association and they care about it. They work for it. Why do that? Because state socialism gives artists freedom from audience, right? In capitalist societies, artists are mostly poor, right? Vincent is a little bit poor, right? Because he's not pursuing an audience, or he hasn't figured out, or he hasn't successfully pursued already an audience. In state socialism, under state socialism, you have to please the infrastructure and the community that is empowered in the state or in the party, and you don't have to please the audience. In fact, you're given power over the audience because you're figured as an architect of the soul, as a teacher or a leader, right? You're a revolutionary, and this is exciting, and this is empowering for artists who so often struggle under the demands of audiences. The reason I don't think we talk about this, one of the reasons I don't think we talk about this, is because the readers actually are in charge. Nobody wants to hear that art is written for them, that it's not the truth, that it's something that's specifically designed to target their demographic. Nobody wants to read a paper about James Joyce's Ulysses that says it's tailor-made for the academic with a huge research library and a lot of time on his hands. And I say his advisedly. Readers don't want to be seen. I used to think that reader reception research was difficult because sociology is difficult, all this other stuff. But no, I actually think readers just prefer to be invisible, just like surveillance agents do. They like to be on the other side of the mirror. This becomes much sharper when we talk about scholarship. Scholars are empowered readers. Foucault knew that surveillance and information create power. And that the accumulation of information has a constraining, possessive, and oppressive outcome, can have that kind of outcome. He knew additionally that the analysis of the scholar, the categorizations, and the interpretations centralize power in the hands of modern institutions. He knew even, additionally, that he was part of this process. But Zero's file points out to us how much of this power hinges on what the reader wants, on their desire. And I think the marks of Foucault's individual interest and his individual desire are all over his analysis, sometimes in a less than self-conscious way. He has this celebrated chapter on the Panopticon, a surveillance prison where inmates are held in open cells in the round. And there's a tower, sometimes a mirrored tower, where one guard can see everybody at once, right? Perfect surveillance, right? And I reproduce his passage on it, and I've bolded the claims he makes about it, which I think are impossible. He claims if you put me in prison for years and don't let me do anything and I have to sit there, he's claiming that because I'm being watched, I will not plan new crimes. And I will absolutely, in that situation, plan new crimes. Doesn't matter if I'm being watched or not. He claims that if you do this to children, that they will stop making noise, that they'll stop wasting time, that workers who are perfectly surveilled will stop being slow or being distracted. I think he sees this really operatic level of positive outcome because he's an interested observer. He's thinking like Jeremy Bentham, who invented the Panopticon. He's thinking like a designer, like a guard. He's not thinking like an inmate, right? The abstract completeness of the Panopticon, his description, helps him make his point about modern power, about its completeness, and about its intensity. But the historical record, this is the Presidio Modelo, which was built in Cuba, the image, and abandoned not very long afterwards. These systems don't really work. Roy Boyen wrote a scholar named Roy Boyen wrote an article about panoptic style systems of control, and he concluded they don't work that well. The reason they persist, he theorizes, is that the Panopticon remains as a figure of desire within welfare capitalism, end quote. The consumers, the readers, want to see these infrastructures as perfected or perfectible. And it's not about looking at the actual situation. Right? So we're already playing with the road forward, which is Eugene's solution, which is Zero's solution, and which is also Helen Freshwater's solution at the bottom of the slide. Identify in the role of the person subject to surveillance, subject to stricture. Speak from that place, right? Remember that whether you're a scholar or an artist, you are not the designer of the panopticon, but an inmate inside it. That's a problem, right? To write a book about stricture in China and in American culture. This, by the way, this slide is another citation from file 0. Zero's file ends with a blank page as a sort of indicator of that which does not appear in the file and its incompleteness. And here I reproduce it for you because there are many things. Now, if we make the decision to speak from the position of the surveilled, to speak from the position of the censored and the restricted, if we speak from that position, there's lots of things we can't do. And there are two common traditional types of books about censorship, about Chinese censorship. One is the kind that explains the structure in the system, right? It illuminates the systems through which censorship takes place. Here's a government structure, here's a relevant statute, here's a regular practice. So these kinds of books are useful to scholars and they enhance human knowledge. But to the inmate, as a person who's trying to publish in China but can't, a person who's trying to write something in the United States and the scholarly infrastructure doesn't allow that, or the rejected essay, or the person with no audience, to that person, these descriptions have limited use. For one thing, they don't circulate. I mean, if you're going to write about China, these books aren't going to circulate in China outside of official circles. So they're making CCP decisions legible, and in some cases to seem a little bit rational, and without actually giving people who are struggling against those restrictions intelligence that they need. They also often, and not every single one, I have examples in the chapter, but they do what Foucault does. But they make the regime of stricture look and feel competent and important and full of extractable concepts. They align the power and the value of the scholarship with the power and the value of the state. The more powerful the state, the more useful the book, right? And they don't all, this isn't universally true. And I read a lot of this scholarship in the book. And this genre of book really does watch the watchman. It really does surveil the surveiller, which is extremely powerful. But if the goal is to identify with the target of surveillance, then you can't really write like that. So there's a similar problem, although about writing about the more maybe compelling topic, which is to write about dissidents and freethinkers and criminals. But that's a problem too, because these works don't circulate in the PRC, because works about censorship won't circulate in the PRC, and also because they will circulate in official circles in the PRC. If you identify and expose people who are living in excess of common constraints, their work gets harder. That being visualized actually makes their lives more difficult. There are exceptions, like some people like Ai Weiwei or Yan Liangke, they use transnational attention to perform certain artistic and social actions. But for the kind of research that I've done before, where I hear that somebody's doing something interesting in a village in Zhejiang, and I go out there and I meet that person, I get all their texts and I read them really carefully, and then I put a big sign that says, "This is interesting, look at this person breaking the rules." Doing that does not help that artist, right? Beidao is very explicit and I think very eloquent about being tagged as a dissident, a literary dissident. He says he talks about it in terms of being sorted and filed and closed off from literature in a way that's totally identical to how Zero is sorted and filed and closed away. This conundrum, this problem, right, which is to say, I can't really do the traditional types of, if I'm going to identify with the inmate, I can't do the traditional types of scholarship. This is something that convinced me that the problem with surveillance, when surveillance is a problem, isn't just this sort of psychic burden of being watched, or this discomfort with being watched. It causes real pain. It causes real trouble. You can out someone, you can constrain someone, you can categorize them in a way that harms them if you do it wrong. So what do? Right? It seems clear that the book has to do something here in English. When I think about a person fighting their constraints in China, whether that's in Beijing or Hong Kong or wherever, a thing that gives them life and power, that seems to give them life and power, is the presence of other communities in liberation, vigorous movements that are expanding the circle of speech and listening elsewhere. Ferguson and Occupy Central are connected. right? Occupy Wall Street and Tiananmen are connected, right? Prisoners have their own cells, but they resist in temporal and intellectual solidarity with each other. So as someone who labors under strictures, even though mine are sometimes different from those in the PRC, there is a subset of resistance behavior in the PRC that I can use against my own limits, and vice versa. It is not enough then to read poetry that's directed against the Chinese government or Chinese conventional wisdom. It's not even really necessary to study art that arrays itself against the state. The question is how poems can work for us in the context that we're in. I don't think File Zero is a dissident poem. It doesn't strike me as a dissident poem. And yet I learn a lot from it. I learn a lot from it. I take from it things that I should do as a reader and scholar. This, by the way, is exactly the same thing that happens when we discuss the limits of form. We're constantly translating, borrowing, mutating forms from abroad. And those echoes of transnational transfer of form don't obey rules of inheritance or influence. Second thing, this borrow, translate, mutate process doesn't produce regular scholarly authority. If I do it, I don't get to have a comprehensive archive. I can't offer my readers the real China, that sort of sinological real China. For this book, those things probably have to just go. To take a view that can be accepted as objective and informational probably already means enthusiastically participating in modes of surveillance. So I won't offer a story about China. Rather, I'll offer a set of experiences and ideas about being in and out of China and the United States. Third, when I imaginatively sit in my cell in the Panopticon, or my office, or in my house during the pandemic, which is a sort of prison, it no longer seems sufficient to me to explain or describe the situation or to say that it's bad. Something else has to happen. It's necessary to say it's bad when it's bad, part of the experience, but the problem of the prisoner isn't really about a lack of understanding. Prisoners understand, right? The prison. Accordingly, the last part of the book that I'm writing will be about proposal and action, about new taboos, new limits that we can use to forge sustainably heterogeneous communities in speech. The last thing is sort of self-evident, and I'm about to finish. After reading File Zero, I don't want to just be a reader anymore. I don't want to be an analyst. The poem challenges me to be an author, right? As a first step, and just as a ritual, sort of a ritual step to close out, I want to finish tonight, not with a conclusion or a set of abstractions, because there is no conclusion, there is no set of sort of summative abstractions here, but with a poem that I wrote for the book chapter. In so doing, I want to walk away from the tradition of the China bridge, the China explainer, the China researcher, and towards the work of people like Fred Moten. I want to improvise among the competing levels of authority that dominate my writing. And I want to expose my own presence as a reader and interpreter, as a person. I want to remind you that you are an audience consuming my text, whether I'm reading you a poem or not. In this particular poem that I'm about to read, I want to get across, additionally, an experience that I had many years ago now that provoked the book, that actually got me to start working on the book, but which can't fit into its archive of citation, or any archive of citation, because it was told to me as a secret and in confidence by a total stranger who I had never met before and never met again after just a single 5-minute interaction. There no proof or evidence was provided, and yet I believed this thing that I was told. And so here is the poem. In the form of a deep hole. The only authority is the entire archive. Did you know I wrote this in lockdown? My son is singing. That is the archive. He hit me yesterday. Archive. Archive. The books I read and the ones I didn't, where the Google Books excerpt ended when I gave up, the shadow texts I'm always deeply citing, the fantasy novels and my teacher's beliefs, the day I went out to see an archaeological site out in the Sichuan countryside, and it was just a hole with plexiglass on it, a big blank field where someone had stumbled across bronzes and pots. There was a man driving the car who said, the only good poems in China are unwritten. You have to be with the poets to hear them. The best authority is the farmer who dug the hole. The real authority is whatever is in the vast undug field. The functional authority is the cadre who decided that the digging has to stop. The true authority is the clatter of tools in the bronze workshop as it contended with silence's ancient, patient bureaucracy. Thank you guys very much. And I guess we will open for questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nick, for this absolutely, I don't know, when I say shattering, I don't know that's the right word, but really.
The faculty writers group, the faculty writers group called it vertiginous. And I took it as, I don't know, 6 of them.
Oh my God, it's really disorienting. It's wonderfully disorienting, but really lots to think about. In terms of speaking from the position of the surveilled, of the image, and really more generally about your and our position as about what we do. And I really admire the depth of your rethinking about the work we do as readers, I'm afraid to say, and forms of reading that could be possible in spite of there being always associated with forms of surveillance. So thank you so much. And we'll start from a question from Joshua Young. Hi, Josh.
Hi, Josh.
And and so he's saying, though I know you're trying to go around state censorship, I'm interested in the popular production of what we have to call literary expression in the internet cat and mouse game of temporarily getting around censorship in the PRC. So would you consider this popular poetry? Are the visible strictures in some ways productive?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. And I think, and I don't think contrary to the spirit of the presentation at all. You can read it. Honestly, I think you can read work like that in 2 ways, and I think it should be read both ways. One is to appreciate the ingenuity and the inventiveness of people who are encountering strictures and then overcoming them. You can think about it in terms of like that first 3D film, when you see the first ever 3D film, and it's supposed to be flat, and you know it's flat and it can't do anything else, and then you put on the glasses and it jumps out at you, like, that's cool, right? That's cool that you could do that. You've moved outside of your media, you've moved outside the restrictions. There's that sort of joy, and I think that that's what's happening in the immediate reception of those of that sort of thing. The other way to read it is as art, and I think you're right, you have to read it as art. To take it out of its context and just say, here's a beautiful way to speak. And I do this in class, and I know it's a little bit exoticizing, but it's also just wonderful to look at the grass mud horse, and like sometimes I show the coat of arms of a Chinese internet researcher, and it's got the grass mud horse, and it's got the crab with 3 Dai Sangha Biao, it's wearing 3 wristwatches, and there's all this code. And the result of it is this incredibly dense, meaningful, but also beautiful object. And I think the problem of the censorship researcher is it insists that we look at the relationship to censorship, and sometimes it loses the portability of the result, right? That these things then can sometimes come out of their original context and can go other places and are beautiful and interesting in their own right. So yeah, I do think, and I think our art is generated this way. The art that we enjoy, appreciate in whatever context, whatever restrictive context we have, it's also generated this way. An artist is thinking, okay, I've got 2 days. I need to make a painting and I need to sell it for $350, right? And what they come up with is a response to those restrictions. But we take that as just art, capital A art. Whereas what the netizens are doing, or what people circumventing internet restrictions are doing, we see less as art, right? We see less as sort of separable from its context. But yeah, that's a neat question, and I wish I knew more. I don't know, my internet. I'm middle-aged now, so my internet, sort of lingo is kind of not that fantastic. I wish I was up to date on a lot of that stuff.
Thank you. We have another question from Dylan Shore. Hi, Dylan. And so he asks, fantastic. I'm ashamed to respond to such an excitingly outwardly reaching talk with a traditional question, but here it is. I wonder how you connect Yu Jian's reflections and interactions with censorship to the fact that it's been employed by the state literary apparatus since the mid-1980s. How do you connect it with his poetics, particularly his anti-figurative stances?
Thank you, Dylan, for foregrounding your shame. I love this. Really speaks to my, I think, my ethic and aesthetic. But it is actually a good question, which you know full well, probably. So of course it lines up perfectly. This is not a dissident poem. The argument of the poem is that the relationship that one has with the socialist literary system is equal to the relationship one has with the reader. They're not different in type. They can be different in intensity. They can be different in all sorts of ways, but they're not two separate categories of restriction, right? You have this readership inside the Wenlian, and you have this other restriction inside the popular media. For a poet, I mean, it's a hard life out there for a poet, like I quit. I needed to buy pork chops and more pork chops. I could not. You can't be a poet in a lot of situations without the support of an interested audience, and that's always going to be a trade-off. So this is one of the reasons why I study this poem. I don't think Yu Jian has any critical thing to say about. I mean, he may think that keeping elaborate files on Chinese citizens is stupid or a waste of time, because he's not going to do anything. But it's not, he's not pulling down the system. I think he's supporting it in a certain way by relativizing it in a way that makes it easier for us to understand why it exists in the first place, and that's his game. So I do think the figuration is always his anti-figurative stance is like, you got to make some sacrifices. You got to nod to figuration every so often in all sorts of little small ways. You just try to minimize it wherever you are. So that's my take on that. It's an excellent question. Should I read the next one? I can read the next one. This is from Samuel Koo. To what extent do you see these contemporary Chinese artists and poets as drawing on traditional Chinese examples of writing in times of trouble, for example, Qu Yuan or Sima Qian? Do you see them as drawing more on other cultural models of dissidence, for example, Gandhi or Martin Luther King? In general, do they tend to see themselves in a Chinese or non-Chinese tradition? This is one of the things about writing this particular book and the difficulty of it, is that for the reading and the work that I've done, even though I'm reading, I think I'm contesting cyberspace in China on my shelf back there. I read this stuff, but I don't actually get it. I don't know what they're like as a group. I don't know. There are books that do this, and there are scholars that do this. When you imaginatively transpose yourself into the place of the inmate, you speak from. I'm speaking in many ways from my highly limited experience writing and publishing in China, and the people that I know that are writing and publishing in China or not writing and publishing in China, they're a tiny subset. And so, there may be somebody who, and I think that there probably is somebody who's like, I'm Qu Yuan 2 or Qu Yuan 40, as the case may be, because it's such a popular literary trope. That may exist. I don't know what and honestly, the state's monopoly over surveillance prevents us from finding. I can't take a poll. I can't go travel around and be like, what do you think about censorship, right? I'm not allowed. If I want to answer those questions, I think I need to either trick or seize the power in the power that holds the ability to view the dissident and the freethinker. I need to directly contest that power, and I need to seize part of it, and I can't do that, and I accept that I can't do that. So it's the unanswerability of that question in my context I think is really telling about the situation we're in and what it means to be an inmate. I don't know what the other inmates are doing. I got my cell. My cell has things in it. I can see. I have my relationship to the power and the state, and not somebody else's. If I wanted to be a guard, I could see a lot more. But in this situation, I'm challenged by this poem not to choose not to do that. I get it when people do, but it's not a decision I made for this book. But thank you for the question. That's a really good question.
Hi, so it looks like Professor Jovanet's screen froze, so we temporarily lost her. We do have about 5 more minutes for questions, so we encourage you to submit your questions that you have for Professor Edmondson, if you have any. Oh, there she is.
Hi, I'm sorry, my screen was frozen.
Yeah, no problem.
What's going on?
Changed
Hi.
computers. I think we finished the questions that were available. So I think if there's nothing else, we can probably wrap up if you'd like.
I'm so
no,
sorry.
Wait, we got one.
The first time that happened to me, that my screen was frozen for like 10 minutes. I don't know what happened.
No problem.
So I think there is one more question by Lucas Klein. Hi, Lucas. I'm fascinated by the idea that there's something of the police officer, in all of us when we read. Yeah, indeed, it's a wonderful idea. Another example is James Angleton, Yale English major who was later chief of counterintelligence for the CIA from 1954 to 1975, and would like to hire English majors trained in new criticism for the CIA because the 7 types of ambiguity were good training for espionage. Wow, I wonder if that opportunity is still available now. Can you say more? Maybe that's why some professors can still advertise English, majoring in English for their potential students.
We got job placements. We got them coming down the pipe.
Can you say more about the American context of your book's proposed title? How do we balance the need to understand the severity of the PRC's censorship apparatus with the occasional function of the American gaze at China's problems to distract from Americans' own problems? I think you do it very well in this talk, by the way, but I'd like to hear I'd like to hear you be more explicit.
Yeah, this is a good question. This was something I was thinking about. I think it's a grounds for criticism of this sort of approach, right? And one of my apologia is that this is just one way to do it. It doesn't foreclose other comparisons, right? And comparisons in terms of intensity and power, or in terms of effect, right? You can have one system of restriction here that is relatively humane and one system of restriction here that's relatively inhumane. What I hope to do and what I want to do is to walk away from national measurement and national units as the sort of grounds for assessment, right? So instead of answering the question, the occasional function of the American gaze at China's problems to distract from America's own problems, I'm getting rid of America and China as elements of analysis. I have this chapter on Gucheng. Part of it came out in a piece called Virus as Hermeneutic, and I look at the viralization of Gucheng's work and how it gets slimmed down and people just quote individual lines of it and little snatches of it, and then it goes out into film and it goes out into TV documentary, and his biography gets chopped up and remixed and all this stuff, and look at the way in which the viralization in the United States actually works much in the same way, that things are getting chopped down and remixed and moved out in a way that satisfies this sort of libidinal drive in viewers and audiences. And America can be good or bad. China can be good or bad at that level of analysis. And it doesn't change the thing that's happening in the chapter. So I really, in a lot of ways, I just want to leave it to other people to decide whether they would prefer to live under the PRC's system of stricture or the United States' system of stricture. Some people will choose one or the other for totally arbitrary personal reasons, and I don't want to intervene in that. It's not the kind of thing they'll do in the book. But I think you're right. It's sort of a problem. Yeah. Oh, there's
okay,
more.
great. Yeah, we have 2 more questions, it looks like. So actually 2 are from Sun Peidong and hi, Peidong. Wonderful talk. Thank you very much. I have 2 questions. Are there some similarities or differences between Yu Jian's poems and Jin Yucheng Fan Hua Blossoms novel in using punctuation? Thus, File Zero belongs to
Xi Jinping's generation.
Xi Jinping's generation.
Yeah. Those are fascinating questions. I have not read Fan Hua, I'll be the first to admit, but this punctuation system is really common in contemporary Chinese poetry. The use of white space, Ya Shi, the poet that I translated and published last year, he does it. The way that it, without having seen Fan Hua, the way that it works is it creates space. And it makes the connections in between phrases and nouns and list items a little bit more open to interpretation. So I consider it sort of a lyricizing effect. It also makes gaps in File Zero and can give the impression that things are being left out or that things are being stretched or that they have holes. Mr. Zero, as far as I know, does belong to the same, roughly the same generation as Xi Jinping. His childhood, the recollection of his childhood says that he's good at fighting the 4 pests, which I think puts him in roughly, and I can't say with precision, roughly about growing up during the early Cultural Revolution. So I think I think they're vague contemporaries, but I'm not sure.
Okay, great. We have one last question. How do you think fear is played into this complicated relationship of reader and writer, the surveiller and the surveilled? You talk about irresponsible scholarship exposing the censorship regime and putting dissidents in the spotlight. Do you think this is a labor of fear that scholars enforced on the subjects they study?
Yeah, that's really interesting, and and I know I've met Yenting, and she is very, very articulate about fear, and I've never really considered this, but seeing it now, I will say, and I think this is a sort of Said Orientalism position on this, that when I put the spotlight on the dissident, I don't have to be afraid. Office in upstate New York, right, or central New York. I'm fine, right? So I don't generate fear in my own life. I generate fear in somebody else's life, and that's the problem. I do think that the whole field of China studies is slowly coming to terms with the feelings and the exposure that is created by real intense differences between systems biculturally, right? And that being forced to take sides, being typified as being on one side or the other. These are all non-consensual acts, and we're not used, at least in my generation, we're not used to it. When I went to China, I was welcomed there as a friend, and I saw even certain people in the administration. I worked for the state, you know, and it didn't feel like I had to choose exactly. I might not like certain rules, and I might be critical, but it didn't feel as intrusive as it can sometimes feel now. And I think that my personal solution to that emotional trauma is to insist on the community of the people that are around me, that are the sort of bicultural, transnational scholar, writer, thinker, to be with people who are in the same position, and to be connected to those people. I spent a lot of my career in an office alone, looked a lot like this, and it's a place for fear. It's a place where one starts to take extremely seriously the virtual restrictions that systems and states produce, and it's a place where the haptic, open, satisfying, difficult, weird interactions between people are muted. And I am much less afraid when I'm with people who are undergoing the same thing. And I think that that's one of the reasons why this is like this Gary King piece that I think we studied in class once, that, you know, the Chinese government's not really trying to censor speech. They're trying to prevent organization between people. They're trying to prevent solidarity. Because I think it actually does heal, and I think it actually does protect to the extent that we can be protected. But that's a really good question too. Thank you, Yanti.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Professor Admessen, for sharing this wonderful talk with us tonight, and we'll leave a lot to think about. It leaves us with lots to think about, really. And thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. I wish you great rest of your evening. And again, if please check the links in the chat box if you want to learn more about SEAS. And we also encourage you to sign up for emails and announcements. Okay, thank you again so much, Professor Admessen, and thanks you so much, everyone, for coming, and have a great rest of your evening. Bye.